Welcome to California Frontier, the show about the often overlooked and unexpected early history of the place we call California. I'm your host, Damian Basic. I am really honored to welcome Dr. John Johnson to the podcast. He served as the Curator of Anthropology at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History from 1986 until very recently. He received his PhD in anthropology at the University of California, Santa Barbara in 1988. And since 2003, he taught an annual course on California Indians at UCSB, where he holds an appointment as adjunct professor of anthropology. Dr. Johnson's written contributions include more than 100 studies regarding the culture, history, and prehistory of California's native peoples, especially emphasizing the Chumash Indians of the Santa Barbara region. Dr. Johnson's career is devoted to understanding the culture and history of Native Americans in South Central California through the study of archaeology, archival records, and interviews with contemporary Native Americans. He has published more than 80 studies about Southern California Indians, and I've used his materials, and there's probably nothing better you can get in order to understand the early peoples of the Southern California coast. Dr. Johnson's research focuses on the colonial periods at either end of the Native American experience. 1, the peopling of the New World, and 2, the Spanish mission period of Alta California. He heads a team that has been investigating the earliest evidence for people in coastal California at the Arlington Springs site on Santa Rosa Island. Dr. Johnson is the co-writer and executive producer of a documentary film, 6 Generations, recounting the story of a Chumash family in Santa Barbara from the time of the founding of the mission until the present day. And I particularly wanted to invite Dr. Johnson on because I was at the California Missions Foundation conference at Santa Ynez, and he gave an amazing presentation on the Chumash Uprising, the uprising of Chumash people in Alta California in 1824, exactly 200 years ago. And so I thought it would be great to invite you on, John, to talk about this and to provide us with a little background about this event and what it meant for the people of California and what you have learned about it. So thank you very much. I appreciate your taking the time to do this.
Thank you for having me on. Well, yes, 200 years ago, the Chumash Indians had 3 missions, rose up and fought with the Spanish soldiers at those missions. And the missions were beginning at Santa Ynez on February 21st, 1824. We can go into the details there, but the revolt started there. It then spread to Mission La Purisima and Mission Santa Barbara. So the 3 missions that were involved, and each of the missions had different events unfold after the uprising began. It was probably the most important uprising in all of colonial California. It was certainly the most widespread, and it was a very significant event in the history of Mexican California in particular. So over the years that I've been conducting research in the archives, various archives, I've come across bits and pieces regarding the Chumash Uprising of 1824. There's been a fair amount published about this event, but I keep finding additional pieces of information. And then I've worked extensively with the mission records, the records of baptisms, marriages, and burials. And so I noticed that in the burial register, of course, you find the people that were killed and died in the Chumash Uprising listed. And so I've gradually kept all of this information in a file. And since this is the 200th anniversary, I thought, well, it's a good time to synthesize the information and bring it together. And so I've been working on this and continuing to work on trying to take a deep dive into the records and come up with a new information that hasn't been available before about the uprising. So one of the interesting things is there's many different perspectives on the uprising. Scholars have argued, historians and anthropologists, over what the causes were, for example, whether it was planned or not. And people who lived at that time also had their different points of view about what was unfolding. And we can talk about that. But basically, I just wanted to go over some of the historical sources that I've used, what the conditions were at the missions at the time of the uprising. Talk a little bit about the sequence of events as they unfolded. So what are some of the causes that have been proposed, and discuss these different points of view, and kind of wrap it up at the end. So we can do that in the course of our conversation.
Could you maybe provide a little?
So the kind of historical sources.
Now, I was just going to ask just a little bit of a short
Go ahead.
background. Is when the Chumash people were present at 3 or 4 missions during this time. So I'm guessing San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, Ventura, Santa Ynez, La Purisima. So we got 5, right? Am I correct?
That's correct. There were 5 missions founded within the territory where Chumash languages were spoken. Now, when we speak of Chumash, there was not just one Chumash language, right? Linguists recognize that there were actually 6 different languages spoken within this small portion of California. Chumash, properly speaking, is a name for a language family, a linguistic family. And some of these languages were so distinct from one another that you would have needed a translator for them to have understood each other. For example, the people of the Channel Islands, when they came to the mainland to trade with the Indians on the coast, they spoke different Chumash languages. It would be like an English speaker trying to speak with a Dutch speaker when they crossed the English Channel. We need a translator. And that was the same situation that existed back at the time of European contact. And so, but there were 5 missions founded within this territory where Chumash languages were spoken. But there were also Chumash Indians in the northern part of this territory and in the southern part who went to 2 other missions. So there's a total of 7 missions where Chumash Indians were baptized. People in many of the Chumash Indians in the Santa Monica Mountains went to Mission San Fernando, and those some of them up in the very northern area around the southern Salinas Valley, they went to Mission San Miguel. So a total of 7 missions had populations where Chumash languages, people speaking Chumash languages, were part of the mission.
And were all of these missions involved in a revolt?
No, only 3 of the missions were involved in the uprising. The first of where it began was Santa Ynez. There was actually an Indian from Mission La Purisima who was visiting Santa Ynez, and his relative that he was visiting had been put in the guardhouse. There's some transgression that the soldiers had locked him up. And so he was trying to talk to his friend, and the soldier, the corporal of the guard, whose name was Valentin Cota, felt that the Indian was being insolent, and he ordered the Indian to be whipped. And that sparked an outrage among the Indians there at Mission Santa Ynez. They began fighting with the soldiers and the missionary. There's even some reports that the missionary actually shot and killed one of the Indians in the course of the the fighting. But a bunch of the Indians then from Santa Ynez left and went to Mission La Purisima. Part of the inhabitants of Mission Santa Ynez, the people who were part of that mission, had come from Mission La Purisima originally, and another big portion had come from Mission Santa Barbara. Mainly those were people who had lived in the Santa Ynez Valley originally before they went to Santa Barbara and La Purisima. And then when Mission Santa Ynez was founded much later in 1804, parts of the Santa Barbara and La Purisima communities, parts of them went to help establish that mission at Santa Ynez. So there were relationships between the Indians of Santa Ynez and the other two missions, longstanding. And so a bunch of the Indians then, when the fighting was going on at Missions Santa Ynez, they then picked up and left and went to Mission La Purisima. And the mission at Santa Ynez, they set fire to portions of it. A lot of the furniture was burned, the rooms were burned in the mission, and but a lot of the Indians then retreated to Mission La Purisima from Santa Ynez. And once the word got to Mission La Purisima, it got everyone upset at Mission La Purisima. And there happened to be two travelers from Monterey who showed up, and they were immediately put to death by some of the young men who were, overheated and got violent and killed those two travelers. There were two workers at Mission Santa La Purisima who were killed. So, and then the fighting was going on between the soldiers and the Indians the soldiers of the guard and the Indians at La Purisima. Eventually, the missionary at La Purisima negotiated with the Indian leaders and then was able to leave with the soldiers and their families, and they retreated then to Santa Ynez. And by that time, a troop of soldiers from Santa Barbara Presidio had arrived at Santa Ynez, not knowing that this uprising had begun, and arrived there. And then the one missionary stayed at La Purisima among the Indians, and the Indians kind of took over control of Mission La Purisima. So in the meantime, word had spread to Mission Santa Barbara, and the Indians up there were quite upset. And they took away the weapons of the soldiers, and they allowed the soldiers to leave Mission Santa Barbara to go to the Presidio, but they took away their weapons. And then the troops marched from the Presidio at Santa Barbara up to Mission Santa Barbara, and a big fight broke out there between the soldiers and the Indians, and Indians were killed there. And the Indians retreated up into what today is Mission Canyon, near where the dam was for the dam the creek to bring water to the mission. And they fought the soldiers, and some of the soldiers committed atrocities against some of the Indians. Innocent Indians who were not really involved in the fighting were killed. And then during the night, the Indians from at Santa Barbara got a good portion of the population, maybe half or more of the population, picked up and left, went over the mountains and traveled through the mountains all the way to the southern San Joaquin Valley, where the mission had a rancho at the Rancho San Emilio. And there were two miners, two fellows who were doing mining operations, and they were put to death by the Indians. And then the Indians eventually then took up a stronghold on an island in the Buena Vista Lake, which was a big lake that used to exist, what is now the southern end of Kern County. And they then kind of barricaded themselves there. So that's the way things stood just within a few days after the uprising. Many of the Santa Barbara Indians had fled to the southern San Joaquin Valley. The Indians of La Purisima had been joined by Indians from Santa Ynez, and they took control of Mission La Purisima. And so for several weeks, that was where the matter stood.
So this uprising went on for several weeks. How many people died as a result of the uprising on both sides? Do you know?
Well, we do. We have actually lists of statistics. There were at least 42 Chumash Indians who died, and these include. Let's see. I have a list here. There was 2 who died in the initial fighting, at least as far as we know, at Santa Ynez. There were 2 apparently who died at Mission La Purisima in the initial fighting. This is just at Santa Barbara. There were a number of I think 11 that we can identify as being killed during the fighting at Mission Santa Barbara, and then so that was during the initial fighting. Now, this isn't the end of the story because some additional fighting took place. There was on March 16th. This is several weeks after the uprising on the February 21st, 22nd, 23rd. On March 16th, a troop of soldiers from Monterey and a troop of soldiers from Santa Barbara Presidio both converged on Mission La Purisima to fight the Indians there and take back control of that mission. And there was additional fighting that took place. The records, the report that was written afterwards, say that 16 Indians died as a result of that fighting. However, I can only identify about a portion of those. 7 of them, I think, is all I can identify at this point. So some of my additional research is trying to see if I can figure out who else may have perished during that fighting. And so there were then the 7 young men who had been accused or had been found guilty of killing the travelers and the 2 workers at the mission. They were then tried and found guilty and then shot by a firing squad. So there was a total then up to that point, of about, I think about 38 people that are said to have died, Chumash Indians. But there could have been others. That's what we can or is documented by the records. There was then subsequent fighting that took place. There was then a troop of soldiers from Santa Barbara in April went back to the southern San Joaquin Valley and engaged the Indians who were barricaded on the island there on Buena Vista Lake. They called that the Battle of Los Talares. They referred to the Tule swamp or margins of the lakes that were there in the southern San Joaquin Valley. They referred to the whole area as the Talares. And so they called it the Battle of Los Talares. The Indians beat the soldiers on that particular engagement. And 4 Indians are said to have died. 1 soldier died during the fighting there. And the soldiers had to retreat from the valley. So a total of 42 Indians, again, we can document as having died.
Do you think that for this to take off and to be so extensive and so violent, what was sort of the conditions? I don't know. It seems to me that when there's a moment of let's say there's a moment of violence or somebody's treated badly and people react to it. It doesn't necessarily spread like this uprising did. Was there something underlying that this sort of was the catalyst for, or do we know?
Yeah, I think that there are a number of factors going on here that led to this eruption of violence that occurred at those missions. And one of the, I think, major events, of course, that occurred in colonial California is the effects of the Mexican War for Independence from Spain, which began about 1812 and lasted up until I think it was, 1821 or 1822 when Mexico became independent from Spain. And so one of the first things that happened were the revolutionaries down in Mexico had captured the ports on the west coast of Mexico. And it was from those ports that supply ships used to come up to provision the presidios and the missions in Alta California. And so all of a sudden, those supplies in 1812 were cut off. And so the only way that the presidios and missions could support themselves were on the production of the missions that was going on at the missions. And the labor force, of course, being supplied by the native people who were part of those mission communities. And so an increased burden was placed on the Indians at that time, on the Native Americans at those missions. And this is at the same time that we're getting a decline in the Native American population, because the indigenous people didn't have resistance to the introduced diseases that were coming in, with the colonization of Alta California, the European diseases. And so we get a much higher mortality during mission times. And so the population is declining at the missions at the same time as there's being this increased burden placed upon the workers, the native population. And so we also see that by the time 1824 comes along, the missions have been established for nearly 40 years, in the Chumash region. And so many of the people at the missions, they'd lived their whole lives. The majority, I'd say, had lived their whole lives under the mission system, under the colonial system. And so I think at this point, some of them were pretty well educated. The priests and the missionaries had educated them. Some of them could read and write. A few of them could read and write. And they also have been trained in the occupations that would allow them to make an independent living if they were independent. They were feeling like, hey, it's Mexico's just achieved its independence from Spain. How about us? Isn't it our time to achieve our independence from the authority of the missions? And so I think there was also this feeling of wanting to be, emancipated from under control of the missions. And so we see this taking different forms at different missions up and down California about this time. But in the Chumash region, there was this, the spark that started it all was at Santa Ynez. And then I think the dissatisfaction, the feeling of the burden of the supplying the Presidio soldiers. At the same time, there were certain soldiers who were mistreating the Indians at the missions. And Valentin Cota being maybe an example of that, whipping an Indian for an infraction that was probably didn't justify the punishment. And we can also look into Valentin Cota's life. His father, was it his father? His father had been killed by the Indians. His father had retired from being a soldier himself and had been stationed or had been living there at Missions San Buenaventura when some Mojave Indians came to Missions San Buenaventura. This is about 5 years prior to the Chumash Uprising. And the Mojave Indians had tried to break into a fight broke out between the Mojave Indians and the Indians there at Mission San Buenaventura. They tried to break into where the armaments were kept at the mission, and they had killed Valentin Cota's father. Also, Valentin Cota's wife, her father, the family, according to the family tradition, had been poisoned by Indians very early in the colonial period and had died from poisoning. So Valentin Cota may have been disposed to not be a very friendly guy towards Native Americans. And but we see this. There were some soldiers who kind of abused their positions, and so the mistreatment by the soldiers, at least according to the missionary accounts, was one of the causes of the Chumash Uprising. The missionaries felt that the soldiers mishandled the whole situation.
Wow. So I hope I didn't sidetrack you, but yeah, you were going to go some more into the accounts from also the Chumash people themselves regarding the uprising and what they had to say about it.
Right. We have some wonderful records that are interviews, oral history interviews, with Chumash Indians in the early 20th century. Now, these would have been Indians who had not been born at the time of the Chumash Uprising. They weren't born till, a decade or two later, but they had heard stories passed down to them by people, their parents, and others who had been around when the Chumash Uprising took place. And so when they were interviewed in the early 20th century, they passed along these stories to an anthropologist, John Harrington, who, 99% of what we know about, Chumash languages and traditional history, come from the work of John Harrington in the early 20th century. And so he interviewed an Indian woman at Missions Santa Ynez who gave him the story as she heard it about what had transpired. And then he also interviewed an Indian woman at Mission Santa Barbara, Luisa Ignacio, who also told him the story as she heard it. And then we have a few other documents that are closer to the time of the uprising, where the Indians are giving their perspectives, both through interrogations or through of some kind, or military investigations. So we have these different sources coming from the Chumash perspective. We also have a story, the missionaries wrote about it at the time. We have their perspective, which is different. And then we have the government officials and the soldiers and what they wrote about it. And then we have people writing actually many years later, after California became part of the United States, who are reflecting back on that time period, either through interviews or through their own memoirs about what transpired at that time. So these are some of all the sources that we have. And the military government officials tended to blame the whole uprising on the Indians plotting to do this. They said the Indians had deliberately been planning to do an uprising at these missions. The missionaries didn't see it that way. They blamed it on mistreatment by the soldiers that led to the revolt. And the Chumash Indians had an even different perspective. In the accounts of the Chumash Indians, they're blaming another Indian. And so at Santa Ynez, the way the story goes, there was an interpreter or a page who worked closely with the missionaries who saw a couple Indians partaking in a traditional activity, taking a narcotic called pez pipata. That was it's California Spanish word for it. It's a mixture of tobacco and lime that the Indians would take in the evening, and it would the lime would activate the alkaloids in the tobacco and give sort of a high. And so the Indians were partaking of this, and he said, "Okay, I'm going to go tell the missionary." And then he went to the missionary. And he said, "The Indians are going to, planning to attack you." And so they blame this one Indian as being deceptive and causing this misunderstanding that led to the uprising. So those are the Indian accounts. Both the accounts of Luis Ignacio and the account of Maria Solares mention this. And there's even a account 2 years after the uprising, 2 or 3 years after uprising, where there's a military investigation about something else. But one of the Indians come forward and he says, the cause of the uprising was the Indian that you are using as the interpreter for this particular investigation. he's the one that caused the whole thing to begin with. And so we know who the Indian was. We know the name of that individual. But the Chumash perspective was that he had caused the misunderstanding, you might say. That's probably maybe too soft a word, but that led to the fighting.
Do you think that
there's also yeah?
No. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'll have a couple questions later.
Okay. Well, I was also going to mention there's a very famous leader, Chumash leader, who emerges from all of this, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about him. But if you have another follow-up question you want to ask first, we can.
No, go right ahead. I want to hear about this.
Okay, this is Pacomio. And Pacomio was an Indian. We can identify him. He was at La Purisima mission. And he was, as a boy, came from a village called Snisowe, which is today later on there was a rancho called the Sway Rancho. It's in the Santa Maria vicinity in northern Santa Barbara County. And that's named after the rancheria he came from. Anyway, he was baptized as a boy at Mission La Purisima. And according to some accounts, he was raised and trained and became very close with the missionaries, the missionary Father Mariano Payeras, who later on became the president of the California missions. He worked closely with Pacomio. Pacomio was, as a profession, became a professional carpenter. And even we know he even was borrowed at different times and he went up to Monterey at one time with some other Indians to do some carpentry work up at Monterey. Anyway, he's apparently a very accomplished individual and well skilled, and was a leader among the people. And he emerges as the leader during the Chumash Uprising, the one that the Spanish are negotiating with, and so on. And he then, after the mission was retaken, and after the fighting of March 16th, he was then banished along with three others that were viewed as the ringleaders. They were banished to Monterey, or he went up to Monterey, where he settled. He went with his wife and settled there. And lived a very, exemplary life as a citizen of Monterey. He later on was even elected to the city council in Monterey, Pacomio. And he's a fascinating individual because he also was living in both worlds. He also was continuing his Chumash traditions. And in 1901, the Alfred Kroeber, who was the prominent anthropologist, he was the first anthropologist hired by the University of California. And Alfred Kroeber, he's known for his very massive book, a standard reference book on the Indians of California. Well, Kroeber in 1901 interviewed an elderly woman in Monterey who was from the tribe of that area. Her name was Viviana Soto, and Viviana Soto sang for him a number of songs, and he recorded them on wax cylinder recordings. And two of the songs that she sang for Kroeber were songs that Pacomio had sung, that she remembered them from ceremonies she'd attended as a girl in Monterey, where Pacomio would sing these songs as well as danced with his dancing regalia, his body painted, she even described it, red and white, and so he's a very interesting individual, I think, Pacomio, and he remains in Monterey. He did try to get land down in La Purisima during the Mexican period when land grants were being given out, but as I understand it, was unsuccessful in that. And he eventually, tragically, both he and his wife died in 1844 during a smallpox epidemic that began in Monterey and then actually spread south. And many of the Indians at San Luis Obispo and La Purisima and in the Monterey area, succumbed to smallpox during that 1844 epidemic.
Do you know why the uprising didn't spread to the other missions that were in Chumash territory?
That's a very good question. Why didn't the other missions, San Luis Obispo and San Buenaventura, also participate in the uprising? And so we know that some emissaries were sent to San Buenaventura, but it's disputed as to what actually occurred. That one account says the Indians of San Buenaventura didn't want to participate; they decided not to participate. Another one says that the emissaries were then captured, and they're prevented from informing the Indians at San Buenaventura what was going on. Up at a similar kind of thing, I think. Maybe it may have happened up at San Luis Obispo. We know that. Well, our source for that, what transpired at San Luis Obispo, is very slim and I think unreliable. Again, he's talking about Indians being sent as emissaries who were captured, but the source is Vallejo, is Mariano Vallejo, and Mariano Vallejo, who wrote a memoir that was just published a couple of years ago. A translation is now available for everyone to read of his memoirs. He's unreliable, I think, in his account of the Chumash Uprising. There's a number of things he says that are factually incorrect and even, I think, bordering on fantasy of what took place at that time.
What prompted you to dig deeper into this uprising? I'm sure part of it was the 200th anniversary. Were there any other particular things that made you want to understand it better?
Well, so much has been written from many different perspectives about what transpired. I guess I'm just wanted to dig deeper to see whether more truth would emerge from all of this, a better perspective on it all. And so the accounts, both at the time from the different, the soldiers versus accounts versus the Chumash accounts versus the missionary accounts about what transpired, they're very different than each other, what actually took place. And then the later historians and anthropologists writing about it, too. Everybody thinks they're an expert on this particular topic. And I just wanted to get to the bottom of it just to see if and bring together these pieces of information that I've come across over the years into a single effort to figure out what was going on. Yeah, I've described this as maybe kind of like the movie Rashomon, right? Which is a great film by the legendary director Akira Kurosawa. Also, the Seven Samurai and Ikiru. There's a number of great films, and but his movie Rashomon, 3 different people witnessed the same event, and they all have a different account of what took place at that event. And that's similar to what we're seeing in the Chumash Uprising. Everybody's got a different take that's completely different than the others about what led to the revolt. And I've come to the conclusion in the end that there may be elements of truth to all of those different versions, of what transpired.
That concludes part 1 of my interview with Dr. John Johnson. Stay tuned for part 2 of this interview on the next episode of the California Frontier Show. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says, Give a One-Time Donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California History and Social Studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.